Critics and audiences have been at odds with one another for a while now, but there are some movies that have really divided the two. One of the glorious things about movies is that taste is subjective, with people liking and disliking movies for various reasons. An example of this is the occasional differing opinions between the critics and audiences. The divide between critics and fans seems to be growing bigger and bigger with each passing year. And while there are some universally praised movies such as The Dark Knight and The Godfather, and some universally disliked movies like Epic Movie and The Ridiculous Six, there are some movies that fall in the middle. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the most divisive movies of all time, and ones that still to this day cause arguments between critics and audiences. Other than arguably The Dark Knight Rises, Christopher Nolan's movies are universally loved, and it's hard to find a bad word said about any of them. A master of spectacle and bending genres, Nolan has been king of the blockbuster for some time now, with his movies garnering huge amounts of attention, including his new release, Tenet. But while it is still hot off the press, unlike a majority of Nolan's work, it's had a somewhat mixed response. Seen as one of his most ambitious films of all time, which is certainly saying something, Tenet has not only divided critics and audiences, but has also caused controversy amongst both critics and audiences. IndieWire critic Mike McCahill described it as a humorless disappointment, while the rap critic Nicholas Barber declared he was let down by the film, and that it was a head-scratching Bond homage, and seeing as Nolan is such a big fan of Bond, that isn't surprising. The Guardian even went further, giving it a 2-star review and calling it a palindromic dud. That's a burn, I think. However, other critics have given Tenet much more positive reviews, with Empire calling it big, bold, baffling, and bonkers, while Variety described it as grandly entertaining. It's also split audiences as well, with some lost in the plot, while others loved the globe-trotting epic. While COVID-19 will no doubt impact Tenet's box office return, it's safe to say that, like the plot of Tenet, audience and critic reaction have been somewhat confusing. After J.J. Abrams directed the first in the series, Force Awakens had a very similar story to that of A New Hope. Watch the pitch meeting for more on that. The position was handed off to Rian Johnson for Last Jedi, who decided to basically undo everything Abrams had set up in Force Awakens. Before the movie was released, it drew great acclaim from critics who praised Johnson's bold and subversive vision and gave it a certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. This caused excitement amongst fans, with it possibly shaping up to be one of the greatest Star Wars movies ever. Yet it was not as well received among the fan base, and currently sits at a rating of 43% on Rotten Tomatoes. While there are many differing reasons as to why the movie didn't go down, the main one, and the one that divides critics and fans, is Luke's story arc. Oh, and of course that weird milk drinking scene, but I don't think anyone liked that. Fans hated the fact that Luke had become a grumpy old man and had turned his back on the Force, saying that it wasn't the character they knew. Meanwhile, critics loved this development, liking the new grizzled version of Luke. Either way, can we all agree that the milk drinking scene was really uncomfortable? While Fincher's prior movie Seven was a hit with critics and audiences, Fight Club, upon its release, received a lot less praise, with critics listing it as sensory overload full of pretentiousness. However, audiences, for the most part, loved it. They loved the major twist at the end and listing it as one of the greatest of all time. Of course, eventually the critics came around, with many agreeing with its top movie status, but in Rotten Tomatoes, although the acclaim is shared, the critic score is at a surprisingly low 79%, while the audience score sits at a much higher 96%. I guess they're just gonna have to go down to Fight Club and sort it out there. Ooh, shoot, wasn't supposed to talk about that. After the underwhelming reaction of Spider-Man 3, the character of Venom was somewhat in limbo. That is, until Sony managed to grab Tom Hardy to play the part of Eddie Brock and his symbiote chum in the 2018 movie Venom. With the majority of comic book movies, there can be a divide between audiences and critics alike, and that was no different with Venom. And while the film certainly had its detractors in the audience, a majority of fans gave it their full support, describing it as a fun, action-packed movie with an amazing performance from its lead that serves as a perfect homage to the superhero movies of the early 2000s. Critics, however, were not so keen, with the critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes saying that the end result is chaotic, noisy, and in desperate need of a stronger attachment to Spider-Man. As it stands, Venom sits at 82% for fan rating on RT, while the critics' consensus stands at 30%. The 2014 reboot of the Godzilla was divisive enough between fans and critics, but the sequel, King of the Monsters, managed to even top that. The movie, which introduced a host of new monsters such as Mothra and King Ghidorah, is another kaiju action spectacle that showcased amazing visual effects and monsters beating the living daylights out of one another. While a majority of fans loved this and were awestruck by the action, critics were less convinced, with the main criticism aimed at the story, or in their view, lack of. While there are several movies that rely on action as opposed to story, such as John Wick or The Raid, these films are for the most part universally loved, unless you're Roger Ebert, and the action scene's enthralling enough to hide the fact that the story is limited and formulaic. And for some, King of the Monsters does the same thing, but for the most part, critics couldn't get past it. The movie currently has a divide of 83% audience score to the critics' 43%, and all I can say to this is, in the words of Ken Watanabe, let them fight. Netflix's imaginative retelling of the fantasy genre, Bright, has definitely acted as a divisive figure between critics and audiences.
Fairy lives don't matter today.
The human orc buddy cop thriller is one of the highest watched original movies on Netflix, garnering 11 million views on its opening weekend, with its star power of Will Smith and Joel Edgerton being a major draw. It was a hit with audiences who especially loved the message of social equality that were not so subtly placed in the movie, as well as the chemistry between the movie's stars. Critics, however, weren't so keen, saying that it fails to deliver on any of its promises, and were quick to criticize the script. It was pretty easy to see the divide between fans and critics after the RT scores were shown, with the audience score at a highly respectable 83%, while the critic score sits at a lowly 28%. So critics and audiences do not see eye to eye on this one, which ironically is just like the start of a buddy cop movie. While the original animated Lion King is universally adored, the same cannot be said about the live-action remake. A brilliant and heartwarming movie with references to Hamlet, the original Lion King stole our hearts and is one of the most popular Disney movies of all time, with it even having its own Broadway show. So with technology improving, Disney decided to remake the movie, turning it into a quote-unquote live-action movie. For the most part, fans enjoyed the movie, and despite it never hitting the heights of the original, said it was a fun, loving, and faithful adaptation of the original, as well as being a remarkable technical achievement. Critics agreed with the movie being a technical achievement, but the praise stopped there, with critics describing it as a heartless by-the-numbers retelling of a classic movie. While the overall rating may not be as harsh as others, the critic score currently resides at 52%, as opposed to a fan score of 88%, and thus continuing the circle of audience and critics review disparity. After the release of the creepy and mind-bending psychological thriller The Lighthouse, director Robert Eggers' stock has continued to rise, making him one of the hottest properties in town and gathering anticipation for his upcoming movie The Northman. However, while The Lighthouse is mostly seen in a positive light from both audiences and critics, Eggers' debut film The Witch wasn't so popular. Critics found the movie to be a brilliant, slow-burning horror movie that didn't adhere to typical horror cliches, as well as hosting stunning visuals and a razor-sharp script. Some audiences, however, were less thrilled, suggesting that the script and dialogue were convoluted and tedious, and that they lost interest in the plot, with its peaks never being satisfying enough. While some audience members have come around after a rewatch, the movie still sits low amongst audiences on RT with a score of 58%, which was enough to scare the critics, who gave it a resounding 90%. One of the most surprising entries on the list is the recent Brad Pitt space flick, Ad Astra. The sci-fi movie that centers on an astronaut's journey to find his father feels like it should have been a highly popular one with fans. However, fans gave it a surprisingly low rating, with some suggesting the movie was dull and overlong, with the amazing visuals and brilliant performance from Pitt not enough to save it in their eyes. Critics, however, did enjoy the movie, with critics describing it as thrilling and visually intense, backing it up with a score of 84%, but their support for the movie wasn't enough for audiences who gave it a lowly 40%, and in turn, making Brad Pitt cry. Well, maybe. Another surprising entry on this list, and one that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate as a hit with the critics, is the 2001 family movie, Spy Kids. In director Robert Rodriguez's first step into family-friendly fun, critics loved how it was a movie that didn't take itself too seriously and remained family-friendly fun, while making nods to popular spy movies. Audiences, however, were not so nice, with some referring to the movie as nonsensical, cartoonish, and housing insufferable performances from its leads. Yeah, that feels mean. As you can imagine, audiences had a rating to back these words up, giving the movie a 46% rating on RT. But what's shocking is how much critics really loved this movie, giving it a huge 93%, which in context is higher than the 2018 Best Picture movie Green Book, which currently has a critic score of 77%. Moral of the story is, do not get in the way of the critics and their love of Spy Kids. Which movie do you think is the most divisive? Is there one that you hate that others love? Or one that you adore that all your friends hate? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe to Screen Rant for more interesting content.